I lived in an apartment complex that was built during the late 70s or early 80s. Back in its heyday, it was considered a premier property, but time hadn't been kind to it. The years had stripped away its former glory, leaving behind a shell of faded grandeur. The residents were as varied as the complex itself, a mix of families, retirees, and transient tenants. The property was built on uneven terrain, with its foundation resting on land historically tied to Native American tribes. The area had a dark past, marked by skirmishes and deaths that seemed to linger in the air, like a whisper of forgotten history. I lived in 2 different apartments within the complex. My first home was in the midsection of the building, on the 2nd floor near the management office. It wasn't perfect. There was a persistent mouse problem, but it was manageable. That is, until the day I spotted a roach. That was the final straw. I immediately went to the leasing office, where the staff offered me a new unit at the opposite end of the building. It was a corner apartment on the top floor, with brand new furnishings and the promise of no roaches. I jumped at the chance. Less noise, fewer neighbors, and no one stomping around overhead. Or so I thought. At first, I was thrilled with the move. The apartment was peaceful, no roaches, fewer mice, and the quiet I had longed for. But that tranquility didn't last. Strange things began to happen, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore. My partner at the time, now my wife, and I started hearing footsteps. Every night the sounds echoed above us, unmistakable and deliberate. But we lived on the top floor. Who or what could be walking above us? The footsteps didn't stop at mere wandering. They seemed to follow us. When we went to bed, we'd hear them enter the bedroom, pacing in circles in the corner before settling. The same thing happened in the living room. The sound was deliberate, purposeful, as if someone or something was watching us. It became a pattern we couldn't ignore. The building had a slanted roof, which led me to consider the possibility of someone in the attic. But the idea didn't make sense. Why would they stay above our apartment specifically? And why would they follow us from room to room? If it were a stowaway, wouldn't they try to remain quiet? No, this was something else entirely. The sound wasn't just above us. It felt inside the apartment, like it was sharing our space. Eventually, I came to believe we were dealing with a spirit. I brought it up to my partner, but she preferred not to engage with such things due to her spiritual upbringing. She believed in spirits, but avoided acknowledging them unless she felt directly threatened. I, on the other hand, had always been open to the paranormal. In another life, I'd nearly pursued the priesthood, fascinated by exorcisms and spiritual warfare. I've been told I have the gift of discernment, visions of the past, glimpses of the future, and a knack for seeing truths others overlook. But I digress. The spirit in our apartment came into focus in my mind's eye. A young man, mid to late 20s, with a scruffy beard, a flannel shirt, and faded blue jeans. He seemed tired, disheveled, and deeply sad. I imagined him walking on the ceiling, his footsteps inverted, pacing in tight circles before sitting cross-legged, watching us silently. He wasn't threatening, but his presence was unnerving. It felt as though he had attached himself to us, unwilling or unable to leave. One night, I experienced something even more unsettling. My partner had gone home for the evening, leaving me alone in the apartment. As I settled into bed, the mattress began to tremble. At first I thought it might be the faint rumble of a distant train, a sensation we occasionally felt from several miles away. But there was no train. I adjusted my position, thinking perhaps it was a nerve or muscle issue, but the shaking intensified. It wasn't subtle anymore. The bed was shaking. Alarmed, I whispered the Our Father prayer, hoping to ward off whatever was causing the disturbance. The shaking continued for another 30 seconds before it finally stopped. I called my partner, asking her to come back and spend the night. She agreed, but shared something unsettling from her own evening. When she arrived home, she found her bedroom door inexplicably locked. The handle wouldn't budge no matter how hard she pushed or turned it. Frustrated and shaken, she called her grandmother for help. Her grandmother, a deeply spiritual woman, forced the door open with effort. The resistance was uncanny, almost as if an unseen force had barricaded it. This incident had occurred around the same time my bed had started shaking. The coincidence was chilling. When my partner returned to my apartment that night, her presence brought me comfort. The rest of the night passed without incident, but the memory of those events lingered. The footsteps, the shaking bed, the locked door, all of it painted a picture of something we couldn't explain. I never felt truly alone in that apartment again. Something was always there, watching, pacing, waiting. This happened in 2022, back when I was 16. For some context, my mom and I had been delving deeply into the spiritual world at the time. We'd been studying ways to communicate with spirits and even dabbling in magic, primarily as a means to protect ourselves. We'd encountered evil spirits, entities, and even demons on several occasions. What I'm about to share is one of those times. It was a late, cold night, around 9 p.m. The sky was pitch black, and the air carried a strange heaviness, like we were being watched. I had some friends over, Ashley, who shared an interest in the spiritual, and two others, Jack and John, not their real names. Ashley had been eager to learn how to use a pendulum to communicate with spirits, something I'd been teaching her for a few days. That night, we decided to take a walk to the park in our town, a place that already felt eerie under the cover of darkness. As we made our way to the park, that feeling of being watched never left us. It clung to us like a shadow, growing stronger the closer we got. Once there, we sat on the grass, using our phone flashlights to illuminate the area. Ashley began using the pendulum, asking yes or no questions to communicate with any spirits nearby. While Ashley focused on the pendulum, I found myself drawn to a large tree nearby. In my mind's eye, I kept seeing a vivid image of a child hanging from one of its branches. A memory, perhaps, but not my own. It was chilling. I shared this vision with my friends, and Ashley asked the pendulum if the spirit we were communicating with was a child. The answer was yes. A wave of cold unease washed over me as I focused on the spirit. It became clear that this child was tied to the oppressive feeling of being watched and followed. Ashley asked if the vision I'd seen of the child taking their own life was true. The pendulum answered yes again. At that point, I asked Ashley to use the pendulum to determine if a negative presence was near us. The answer, yes. My instincts kicked in, and I felt an overwhelming urge to protect my friends. Something was wrong. The energy surrounding us was shifting, becoming darker, heavier. I looked around, feeling as if we were being encircled by unseen forces. The presence wasn't just negative, it was demonic. I told Ashley to ask the pendulum outright if there were demons around us. The pendulum swung to confirm, yes. My heart sank. At that moment, John got a call from his dad saying he needed to go home. We walked to the road to wait for his ride, sitting on a bench and trying to act normal. But the oppressive feeling lingered. I could still sense the child's spirit nearby, tethered to us. Reaching out mentally, I asked the spirit what had happened. The child revealed they had been driven to their death by the voices of demons. They weren't the only one. Others had suffered the same fate. Rage and sadness welled up in me. These demons had tormented children for decades, and now they were targeting us. When John's dad arrived, we said our goodbyes. But as soon as he left, Jack complained about a sharp clawing pain on his back. Ashley checked and found scratch marks trailing across his skin. The sight confirmed my worst fears. These entities were physically attacking us. Jack's discomfort grew. He said he could feel something trying to worm its way into his thoughts. I immediately performed a protection spell on him and the rest of us, focusing on keeping him safe. As we gathered ourselves, I felt drawn to a church not far from the park. It was about a 10-minute walk away, so we decided to head there. The air seemed to grow darker as we walked, far darker than it should have been. The closer we got to the church, the more oppressive the darkness became, closing in around us like a suffocating blanket. I pointed this out to Jack and Ashley, who agreed. It wasn't just in our heads. Then, the church bells began to chime. It was 10 p.m., an odd time for the bells to ring. Stranger still, they only rang when we walked. If we stopped, the bells went silent. If we moved, they grew louder. It was as if the church itself was aware of our presence, urging us forward. When we finally reached the graveyard beside the church, the bells abruptly stopped. Ashley began taking pictures with her phone, sensing something deeply wrong in the graveyard. She described seeing the spirit of a man who had been part of a pedophile ring centuries ago. Her fury was palpable, and she begged me to do something. I performed a spell, channeling my anger into banishing the spirit to a place of pain and punishment. The next part of the night is a bit of a blur for me. I think we spent about half an hour in the graveyard before deciding to head back to my house. On the way, Ashley continued snapping photos. Each picture seemed to capture something disturbing. Faces that weren't human, claw-like hands gripping trees. At one point, she even caught the image of a face peering back at us, cold and unfeeling. I'd had enough. Once we reached the park behind my house, I drew a symbol of protection in the dirt and instructed everyone to sit in a circle around it. I told them to hold hands, close their eyes, and not let go no matter what happened. I began a banishing spell, pouring every ounce of focus and energy into driving these entities out of our town and away from us. As I chanted, the attacks intensified. We all felt the entities touching us. Jack complained of the clawing on his back returning, but we held firm. When the spell was complete, the oppressive energy lifted, leaving behind an eerie stillness. Ashley took one final picture. This time, the image showed a glowing figure with wings standing next to Jack. We believed it was an angel, a protective force that had joined us in our battle. Exhausted but relieved, we returned to my house. I explained everything to my mom, and my friends eventually went home. I know this story sounds like something out of a creepypasta, and maybe it is too bizarre to believe. But it's the truth, and it's been haunting my thoughts ever since. I had to get it off my chest. In 1986, when I was about 5 years old, my dad's job moved us out of Brooklyn to a quiet town in Connecticut. We bought a house tucked away on a winding road, surrounded by 3 or 4 acres of dense woods. The contrast from our crowded Brooklyn neighborhood couldn't have been starker. My mom, just 27 at the time, loved the scenery and the quiet. My dad, about 30, enjoy the slower pace. For a while, life was peaceful, but that peace didn't last. It started with my mom noticing a man, a stranger, who seemed to show up everywhere she went. At first, she brushed it off as coincidence, but it wasn't long before she grew uneasy. She'd see him at the supermarket, where he'd smile at her from a distance. She'd take my sister and me to the park, and there he'd be again, sitting on a bench, watching her. Over time, his presence became more frequent, more deliberate. My mom mentioned it to my dad, but he chalked it up to paranoia or small-town familiarity. After all, in a town like this, you were bound to run into the same people occasionally. But my mom knew better. The encounters became unnerving. She began avoiding places she thought he might be, but somehow he was always there. Then came the breaking point. One afternoon, while leaving to pick up my sister from nursery school, she spotted a car parked on the road just beyond our driveway, barely visible through the trees. When she pulled out, the car pulled out too. It followed her all the way to the school. Once there, she saw him again, leaning against his car, sunglasses shielding his eyes but clearly staring at her. My mom's Brooklyn grit kicked in. Furious, she started shouting at him, yelling every curse she could muster. The man panicked, jumped into his car and sped off. Shaken, my mom called my dad at work, crying and demanding something be done. That night, my dad called the police. When the officers arrived, they listened to my parents' story and nodded knowingly. They already knew who he was. The man, they explained, was someone they had dealt with before. He was simple-minded, they said, harmless, just socially awkward and incapable of taking a hint. He had never been violent or threatening, just a weirdo who got fixated on women. The police assured my parents they'd speak to him and his parents, who he still lived with, and warn him to stay away. Later that evening, the man's parents called, profusely apologizing. They promised to make him stop and assured my parents they'd keep him under control. My dad, likely trying to be understanding, decided to let it go. Everyone shook hands, metaphorically speaking, and moved on. For over a year, the man disappeared from our lives. No sightings, no strange encounters. My dad, ever cautious, would occasionally drive past his house to ensure his car was parked there. It seemed the problem had resolved, until one summer night in 1987. That night is burned into my memory. It was around 9 p.m. and I was in bed, still awake, listening to my parents watching TV in the living room. My sister left her room and walked down the hall, but moments later, chaos erupted. My sister was having an asthma attack, her first severe one, and was struggling to breathe. My mom and dad sprang into action. My dad called 911, and my mom rushed her into the bathroom, turning on the shower to create steam. I stood in the hallway, wide-eyed, watching the panic unfold. Amid the chaos, I wandered toward the den and the staircase leading to the front door. It was a split-level ranch, so the front door was at the bottom of a short flight of stairs. I was hoping to find my dad, who had just run into the kitchen to call 911. When I saw the front door wide open, standing at the bottom of the steps was a man staring up at me. I assumed he was a police officer. I mean, who else could it be? My dad had just called 911. "The police are here," I yelled toward the hallway. But the moment my mom appeared behind me, she let out a scream so visceral, it froze me in place. I'll never forget it. She screamed, "It's him! It's the fucking guy." Everything happened so fast after that. My dad bolted down the hallway toward us, his face a mix of confusion and fury. He had a daughter gasping for air in the bathroom, and now this. a man standing in his doorway, uninvited. The man took one look at my dad and ran, bolting into the night. My dad started to chase him, but stopped short, realizing he knew where the man lived. He turned back, barking at my mom to get me into the kitchen. My mom grabbed me in a state of near hysteria and rushed me out of the hallway. The police arrived within minutes, followed by the EMTs who stabilized my sister. But now the focus shifted to the stalker. The officers pieced together what had happened. The man had been spying on my mom for months, watching her through the windows from the cover of the woods. He'd seen the commotion in the house that night and, in his warped mind, decided to step in, perhaps to save the day. The police caught him running down the road, not far from our house. During questioning, he admitted to taking drives at night to watch my mom. He didn't see what the big deal was. He wasn't violent, he insisted, just curious. In the end, he pled guilty to trespassing and stalking-related charges. He served some time in jail, though I'm not sure how long. My parents couldn't take it anymore. By the fall of that year, my dad put in for a transfer, and we moved back to Brooklyn. Over the years, my mom has learned to tell the story with a laugh, but I don't think she's ever truly shaken the memory of that night. Decades later, we learned from old neighbors that the man was eventually placed in a group home after his release. He died of a heart attack in the late 90s. That night and that man left an indelible mark on my family. True story. Scary as hell.